Some of you know that my doctoral work is in the area of black evangelical Christianity. And some of the very people I wrote about are sitting here in the front row. Dr. Crawford and Dr. Perkins were subjects of this dissertation that I did. So I'm very honored to be a part of this very important, significant historical gathering. So thank you for the invitation to be here with you. I'll begin with a story and let you know that a couple years ago I turned 50 years old. You can say I don't look 50, that's all right. I don't look it, right, okay? Black may not crack, but Asian don't raisin. So, so when I turned 50 years old, I said, I'm going to do what I thought I was going to do in the decade of my 40s. So those of you who turn 40 or turn 50, you know what I'm talking about. I said, this is the decade when I turn 50. I'm going to get physically fit. I'm going to get healthy. This is the decade. Now, I made that promise when I was 40. It didn't happen in the decade of the 40s. So I said, this is really the decade that I'm going to get fit and physically healthy. So I'm an academic. I do research. So I went online and did research with Google, the most important tool for academics, and I type in, what is the best way to stay fit in this time period? And it turns out there's a program called CrossFit. Any of you heard of this? CrossFit? Yeah, some of you do it? All right. I don't do it, but what I found out is that the philosophy of CrossFit is something I agree with very strongly. The philosophy of CrossFit is something called muscle confusion. Do you know this? Muscle confusion. And that's fantastic because that's been my approach to exercise my entire life. And the way I've applied it is I don't go to the gym for months and months, and then when I go to the gym, my muscles are confused why we are there. Now, as I started thinking about this idea of muscle confusion, I began to ask, if muscle confusion, a disruption in our physical being, is a good way towards physical health, is it possible that spiritual confusion and disruption is a good way towards spiritual health? And are there places where we don't want to be disrupted, encounter confusion, because we like the way things are? Richard Sennett, a philosopher, said it this way. He said, without a disturbed sense of ourselves, why would any of us want to change? We change because we don't like the way things are. We see that there is discomfort in the world and there's disruption in the world, so we seek change. And when we come to things like reconciliation, or more accurately, conciliation, we have to recognize that things are not the way they're supposed to be. And it leads us to that sense of disruption and discomfort that says, what are the changes that God is calling us to make? I want to introduce you to an approach to practical theology. If we can put that first slide up. This is the what's called a hermeneutical circle that was taught to me by one of my mentors, academic mentors, Eldon Villafañe. And he says that in order to do practical theology, in order to live out your theology in the church, you need actually 3 steps. Not just 1, 3 steps. The 3 steps are clarification, if we can get the slide up, conceptualization, and confrontation. Confrontation is what we jump to first, which is how are we going to fix the problem? And we get to it without really thinking about the problem in the first place. So confrontation are the books that are easy to read. 5 ways to grow your church. 7 ways to do things right. 3 ways to have a more healthy such and such ministry. Those are the confrontational methodologies that pastors, I was a pastor, you jump into that piece right away. But you've got to do the first 2 steps, which is clarification, which is understanding what's going on in the world around you. If you don't understand what's going on, you're just shooting in the dark. You're just shooting off into blindness and trying to figure things out. Understand what's going on in the world, clarification. And then conceptualization is the theological, biblical response to what's going on in the world. Then you get to the confrontation. Then you get to the how-tos and how are we going to fix this. The problem oftentimes is we jump to that 3rd level before we get to the 1st and 2nd level. So today, I want to give you a disruptive clarification. I want to offer you an analysis of the world we're living in, how we got here, and I hope that causes dis-ease so that we turn to the scriptures, we turn to our theology, and we begin to formulate a way forward, a confrontation forward. Are you with me? All right, let's talk about clarification. How did we get to where we are? Are we having trouble with the slides? Well, I want to offer you the teachings of 2 excellent sociologists by the name of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. Berger and Luckman talk about how does social reality come into play? How do we get to where we are? What are the factors that lead to where we are? They outline 3 levels. The first level is externalization. That's when individuals come into a context like this and we externalize who we are, our values, ideas, thoughts, the things that we have lived through, our history. We externalize that, and as individuals, we begin to shape the world around us. But there's a second and third level that are just as important. The second level is called institutionalization. And that's when, after we have individually externalized into the social context, that social context begins to take on a life of its own. And it begins to form systems and structures to retain that reality. So externalization is the individual influencing the system, but institutionalization is the system itself taking on a life of its own. This is where we sometimes get mixed up with racial reconciliation. We think if we just change individuals, the systems will change. You've got to change both. You've got to change the individual and you've got to change the system. The system is changed by externalization, but it also has the problem of institutionalization. These are two factors we've got to take into account. Change individuals, absolutely, but change the system as well. But there's a third level that Berger and Luckman talk about that I want to address today, and that's called internalization. And that's when the system not only takes a life of its own, but the system begins to shape and change the people within the system itself. And those of us who are in the system, begin to internalize the values that are in the system. This part is oftentimes overlooked. The equivalent of this is what we call narratives. The stories, the worldview, the way we think about the world, it gets internalized in us so that the thoughts and processes that we live out in our system is based upon what the system has embedded within us. Internalization. So I want to talk about all three, but I want to focus on internalization. We know that we want to bring individual change so that the world can continue to change. We know we need to address broken systems and structure so that the world can continue to change. I want to talk about that third level. How do we change the narratives, the worldview that keeps the system going? Narratives are like fuel. It keeps the system going. If it's a dysfunctional system, it has a dysfunctional fuel that keeps that dysfunctional system going. It permeates and embeds itself in individuals so that the system keeps on going. Let me give you an illustration of this. Let's think about some of the most evil structures in American history. It was alluded to by Pastor Leonce. The first evil system that we know of within American history is, of course, the system of slavery. The system of slavery was set up, and it was set up by individuals externalizing their racism. But it also took a life of its own, so that embedded within the system was this racism that led to the system of slavery. And then the whole idea of slavery got internalized within the system. Now, we saw this broken, evil system of slavery. But thanks be to God, there was a Civil War. There was a 13th Amendment. There was an Emancipation Proclamation that disrupted the system, tore that system down. Thanks be to God. But here's the problem. You tore down the system. You didn't deal with the narrative that drove the system in the first place. So you broke the system down, but if the fuel is still lingering, it will find a new system to express itself. So slavery falls, but a new system crops up, and it's called Jim Crow. And Jim Crow gets established and is almost as effective as the system of slavery. It marginalized the African American community. It denies the right to vote for the African American community, and it creates an oppressive system that is almost as bad as slavery itself, because the fuel that drove slavery is now driving Jim Crow. But thanks be to God, we again had right here in this city, right in the United States, around Martin Luther King, you have a civil rights movement. You have the Voting Rights Act. You have changes within the system, and it tears down the system of Jim Crow. But again, we didn't deal with the fuel that drove slavery, and we didn't deal with the fuel that drove Jim Crow, and the fuel found a new way to express itself, and it is the new Jim Crow, and it has now found a different system, but it is almost as effective as the old Jim Crow and almost as effective as slavery itself. Because we never dealt with the fuel that kept fueling these dysfunctional systems. Think about the new Jim Crow. The new Jim Crow has been effective through mass incarceration, through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, and being almost as effective in terms of suppressing African American electoral power as almost as effective as the old Jim Crow. The most populous voter district in the United States among African Americans is Washington, D.C. 95, 97% African Americans. What is their representation in the federal government? Zero. No representation of the most populous African American voting district. The second most populous voting district for African Americans in the United States. What is that? Mississippi. About 40-45% African American. They have 6 representatives to the federal government. How many African Americans? 1. 1 out of 6 representing 1 out of 2. How do you get away with that? You gerrymander the districts to death. You incarcerate a large number of black men. You create voter suppression laws so that the black vote is almost as weak as it was under Jim Crow, under the new Jim Crow. We talk about the evil of the 3/5 compromise. There's something called the 0/5 compromise in the US right now. In the state of Illinois, when a prisoner, a black male, is sent away into prison, usually in a rural district, those 5,000 prisoners in that rural jail are counted as, even though they can't vote, are counted as members and as citizens of that rural white community. So now this rural white community has a larger percentage of representation in their government, and the black vote has been taken, not 3/5, but 0/5. They've been taken out of their community and not represented in the government. The narratives of white supremacy. Now, if you don't like that word, just change it to white superiority. I'm not talking about We're not talking about skinheads and neo-Nazis. It's too easy to dismiss that by talking about skinheads and neo-Nazis. It is the assumption that one people group matter more than another. It is the assumption that one people group is superior to another people group. That narrative is so embedded in our society that we see black neighborhoods as subhuman. We see black countries as subhuman. That narrative is still there. We've dealt with the systems, and we should, but we've got to deal with the fuel that drives these dysfunctional systems. These systems are persistent. We see it even into this modern era. Let's think about one particular way. If you can go to slide number 7. Whose gaze determines what is a person's value in American society? I would argue that it is the gaze of the white male that determines the worth of the people in American society. This is the work of Willie Jennings, my mentor at Duke University. He talks about that there is a quadrilateral relationship. There is the white male, there is the black male, there is the white female, and the black female. And how the white male views the black male is how the black male is viewed by society. That's a power. That's a power for the white male to label the black male and decide this is how the rest of the world should view that black male. Think about this with me. In entertainment, in the news, how is the black male portrayed? As 2 things, a pet or a threat. The black male is a pet because we want them to entertain us. We love the black athlete. We love the black hip-hop artist. We love the black comedian. But the second the pet becomes a threat, whoa, 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 all bets are off. What is the greatest threat according to the 6 o'clock news? The greatest threat is the unidentified black male. Because the unidentified black male has committed every crime in your neighborhood. Today on the south side of Chicago, an unidentified black male shot up a liquor store. Today on the west side of Chicago, an unidentified black male was involved in a gang fight. Today in Atlanta, an unidentified black male was involved in a drive-by shooting. This unidentified black male is approximately 5'7" or 6'8" tall. Is approximately 15 or 45 years old. Weighs anywhere from 150 to 350 pounds. If you have seen such a black male, you must report him to the authorities immediately because he is a threat to your neighborhood. So that's why when a skinny little 12-year-old kid is playing in a playground and the police roll up, he's not flashing a weapon out there. He's a 12-year-old kid. He's gunned down within a split second because an unidentified black male automatically becomes a threat. And when the pet becomes the threat, that's when it gets serious. Now, pets are wonderful because you can get them to entertain you. But when hypothetical, these are 2 hypotheticals. The first hypothetical is, let's say there's a great athlete, a quarterback, just hypothetically, a quarterback who takes a very mediocre football team to the Super Bowl. And the town loves him and say, oh, you're the best. And there are articles written about this great quarterback. He is the pet for that region. But the second he takes a knee, what has he become? He's become a threat. Hypothetical. Let's talk about maybe a Christian African-American hip-hop artist. And they love this hip-hop artist. They bring him to every white evangelical conference they can get him to come. They bring him out there to lead them and to put on a show. But the second he tweets a picture of a slave family, then he is a threat and is not allowed to be at those evangelical gatherings anymore. Whose gaze determines the value and worth? That is real power. But that means that narratives that shape these stories, that are embedded within our worldview, has to be changed. We cannot change narratives with more of the same narrative. You can't say, well, we're going to have a multi-ethnic church, but it's going to be all white leadership. You're not changing the narrative. You can't say, we're going to change the world, but all the leaders of that are going to be white. You're not changing the narrative. You've got to change the narrative along with the social systems and structures. Let's talk about an ineffective way narratives were addressed. Some of you might remember this, but I remember very vividly when Magic Johnson declared that he was HIV positive. You all remember that moment? I remember it very vividly. I remember it because it really changed over the years my view on HIV/AIDS. Now, several years ago, there was a massive national movement about AIDS HIV. It was called the Red Campaign. You all remember the Red Campaign? It was on Super Bowl Sunday. They launched it. They spent $10 million for ad revenue to promote the Red Campaign. It had Denzel, it had Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, Tom Hanks. All the A-listers got up there to promote the Red Campaign. Now, the Red Campaign spent $10 million over a 10-year period to address specifically the problem of AIDS HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. Very noble cause. But in those 10 years, they spent $10 million. Do you know how much they raised? $10 million. How much did they actually net for HIV/AIDS? Zero. 10 years, 10 million spent, 10 million raised. Now, what was the Red Campaign about? The Red Campaign asked you to purchase red products made by Apple, made by Levi's, made by Target, and when you purchase those products, a portion of that money would go towards relief of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. 10 years later, they made zero. Now, during those 10 years, who made billions of dollars? Target and Apple and Levi's made billions of dollars, and zero money was made for the actual relief in sub-Saharan Africa. But here's the problem. They were trying to fix a problem with a narrative that created the problem in the first place. I go back to Magic Johnson. When Magic Johnson announced on national television that he was HIV/AIDS positive, honestly, what was your first thought? He's dead, right? Come on, let's be honest. When Magic said on national television, I have HIV/AIDS, you thought 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year, greatest basketball player, arguably, he's going to die. That was my thought. Now, it's been about 27 years since he made that announcement. Anybody seen Magic lately? He's actually kind of looking chunky. He's looking really healthy. Why? Because he has lived 25 plus years with an HIV/AIDS diagnosis. We might not have a cure, but we have a way for a person to live a very healthy, productive life with a positive HIV/AIDS diagnosis. Here's the problem then. The problem is not enough research or research to take the cure to Africa. The problem is the greed of the pharmaceutical companies that wants to charge a person in Africa the same that they're charging Magic Johnson's $1 million insurance company. So what we're dealing with is a problem of consumerism and greed within this situation of HIV/AIDS pandemic. So are you going to solve that problem rooted in greed with more greed and materialism? Let's fix the problem of HIV/AIDS, which was created by this greed. Now you're saying, well, we're going to fix it by having people buy products. You can't fix the narrative with the same things that drive the narrative in the first place. And that is why we need new narratives. New narratives that change not only the individual, not only the system, but change our worldview. New narratives that says there is a value and worth in the other. They're not living in some decrepit situation that God is punishing them for. That is not the narrative that we need. We need the narrative that is rooted in the scriptures. The image of God found in every single human being. The value and worth of every single person, because every single person is made in the image of God. So nobody is subhuman. Everybody has value and worth. We've got to change the narrative. We see the beginnings of this in Micah chapter 4. In Micah 4, it says, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all the people will stream to it. In Micah 4, we're getting the picture of a reconciled community, a community that crosses the boundaries and walls of hostility that have been built up. A people, Jews and Gentile, male, female, slave, free, all the people of God gathering together at the mountain of the Lord. Now, that's an exciting vision that we already see in Micah 4 in the Old Testament. But we have to realize is that there is actually a precondition to Micah 4 happening. The precondition is, yes, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. All the people will stream to it. But the precondition is found in the next verse where it says, they will beat their swords into plowshares. That's the image of what is going on before the worship of God's people can occur. They will beat their swords into plowshares. Now, first I'm thinking as a pacifist, sword is war. We're not going to have war anymore. But there's an interesting passage in Joel that says the exact opposite. They would turn their plowshares into swords. That's very confusing because it seems like the word sword is not a negative word in and of itself. It might be a more neutral usage. And as I've studied the word sword, it's not just the representation of war, which we can see as evil, but sword is also representative of power. Sword is oftentimes a similar concept as power. So what this passage is saying, if you really want a multi-ethnic community, you want to confront the evils of this racism and evils of these narratives, put down your power. Lay down your power. Turn your implements of power into implements of helping others. Turn your implements of war and power and turn it into lifting up others and caring and sharing for others. That's the passage of Micah chapter 4. Lay down your power. If we're going to create new narratives, I would argue that that's one of the first things that we as God's people do. Lay down our power. I'm going to give you a very specific way to do this. Several years ago, I was asked to speak at a very prominent Christian college on the issue of race and in the issue of racial relations. And this is a prominent Christian college that has an incredible history of sending missionaries overseas. And they have this long history of impacting global missions. But the question that I raised, and in the 21st century, given the realities of the world that we live in, and you want to be a missionary as a young white person from America to go to places like Africa and Latin America, and you are a young white person who wants to go and serve the poor blacks in Africa, and you've never had a non-white mentor in your life, you've never had a black mentor when you say you want to go to Africa, you're not a missionary, you're a colonialist. You're going to colonize Africa with your version of Christianity that is a very narrow sliver of Christianity. You're going to have those places where you are not the powerful one with all the right answers, but the powerless one learning from those who are different from you. So my challenge would be, as you seek to build these new narratives in the city of Atlanta, thanks be to God for the work that is happening here. Learn from each other. Value each other. Create new narratives of trust and love. A community that says, my mentor is not just some white guy who wrote a book 50 years ago. My mentor is an African-American pastor who has invested in my life. My mentor is a bivocational, bilingual Latino pastor who is investing in my life. My mentor is a recent immigrant who is working a full-time job and pastoring full-time. That's the person I'm learning from, not some hotshot 29-year-old with skinny jeans. That's not my mental model of ministry. The model of ministry is that local church pastor who is from a different context, from a different narrative. That's how you begin to change the narrative. Atlanta, put down your sword, put down your power, and learn to love and learn from each other.